I think starting 5 or 10 years ago, the Europe's foreign policy is very dependent on the U.S. foreign policy. I remember several years ago, the North Stream 2 pipeline that is being bombed by certain countries, and credible sources and analysis from different experts probably already sure that it was the U.S. did it, but Germany didn't say anything about it. So how come Europe became so dependent on U.S. foreign policy?
Europe was dependent on the United States from day one, from the end of the Second World War. Naturally. Europe was in ashes. It was destroyed as a result of the war. The United States exited the war as the only creditor country and the only country with its manufacturing absolutely intact. Not only intact, but far more efficient than it was before the war. Because they were not bombed and they were producing, and they learned through doing, like China over the last 30 years, they had their industrialization during the war. Because when they were producing aircraft carriers, tanks, airplanes, bombs, and so on, at such a pace, they learned how to produce things. So they ended up in 1945 with factories that were working overtime. And their great worry was, now that the war is over, what do these factories produce? And who's going to buy what they produce? They very quickly switched from producing guns and aircraft carriers to producing jets, passenger jets, to producing washing machines, ovens, fridges, and all that, consumer goods. But they were so efficient that they didn't know what to do with it, because the American market was not large enough to absorb all the washing machines and cars they were producing. They needed Europe. So they dollarized Europe. They sent money to Europe, because Europe couldn't afford any of this. So there was a very simple idea. We give them money, they buy our things. As they buy our things, they give us back our money. Beautiful recycling mechanism. So from the beginning, if you look at the way that the European Union was constructed, it was an American design. The French and the Germans were not talking, really. The Americans took their heads and banged them together, and they said, you are going to form a cartel. And they formed a cartel of coal, steel, manufacturing, and so on. So the European Union was always an American design. And it also had a currency system that was imposed by the United States, the Bretton Woods system, with fixed exchange rates. So it's not new, the dependence. What is new is a total dependence. And the total dependence happened because once the fixed exchange rates ended in 1971, let's not go into why that happened, the Europeans were trying to replace the fixed exchange rates that the Americans had created for them, the Bretton Woods system, with their own. Because they had created a cartel. A cartel needs a common currency. If you and I are producing these cups, and we want to cooperate and not compete with one another, and we need to set a common price, we need to have a common currency. Because if the exchange rate keeps fluctuating, the common price is not common anymore, right? So we need a common currency. So they created a common currency. But how did they create a common currency? The euro. Without a common state, without a common finance ministry. That was a disaster. Because the moment the crisis hit in 2008, from Wall Street, from America again, the European banks that had invested everything, had bet everything, or the whole house, on the Americans, they collapsed. They had a lot more debt than the American banks had. Yeah. But the European state didn't exist to bail out the banks. The central bank, which we had in Frankfurt, the European Central Bank, was by law prohibited from saving the banks. So the Europeans started, the European authorities, putting the burden of bailing out the bankers on the little people, on the working classes. And that created a lot of discontent. My country was destroyed effectively by austerity and loans that cannot ever be repaid. And that created an implosion in Europe. The more our politics imploded as a result of this economic catastrophe, the greater the lack of a capacity for Europe to operate on Europe's behalf, and the greater the dependence on the United States. And then the United States, in 2014, instigates a coup d'etat against Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine. And that was the beginning of the total war now that we have in Ukraine. And at that point, even though President Macron of France or Chancellor Scholz of Germany wanted to end this war in Ukraine, the clash with Eastern European states that used to be under the Soviet umbrella, that wanted a forever war against Russia, if you add to the economic fragmentation and collapse that I described, the East-West divide that came to add itself to the North-South divide due to the Euro crisis and the debt crisis, you end up with a continent which is a complete mess. And when there is a mess, the hegemon gets more powerful, especially when Europe, because of this economic mess, hasn't invested anything in the last 15 years. So now we can't produce batteries to compete with BYDs, with CATLs. We do not have a capacity to produce enough wind turbines. The green transition that we want, we cannot finance. And so we are becoming irrelevant, caught up in the new Cold War between the United States and China.
Do you think that maybe eventually one day Europe will have the backbone to stand on their own feet, say no to the US dominance on their foreign policy? Do you see that day coming?
Hopefully. I go to bed every night and I wake up every morning praying, even though I'm an atheist, praying that will happen. But I don't see it happening. Because this fragmentation, once it has begun, will be very difficult to reverse. The only way it can reverse itself is if European people bind together across the European continent, not as Greeks or Germans, but we find a way of progressive Greeks, progressive Germans, progressive French men and women getting together and creating a pan-European movement in opposition to an establishment that simply wants to perpetrate business as usual when business cannot be perpetrated as usual. So this is why I'm still in politics. This is what it is. This is our DiEM25 movement across Europe, which we're not doing well because those forces, just like the mid-war period between the two world wars, it was a similar situation. The economic foundation of Europe was collapsing because of a crisis that started in the United States in 1929. Wall Street again, so history repeating itself, not as farce, but as a new form of tragedy. And the only political forces that are very successful at harvesting the anger and the discontent are the ultra-right, the racists, the xenophobes, the warmongers, the fascists, which is what's happening today again. So we have a duty to keep trying, keep hoping, without being optimistic, because optimism is the hope of the idiot.
Really?